Right, if you were with us last week, we started the book of 2 Corinthians, got through well, I don't know if we got through it or not, but at least that's what we're supposed to cover, the first two chapters there in that book. And tonight we're going to be looking at chapters 3 and 4. If you're not already over there in your Bibles, be turning over there. Kind of scratched the first question. It was, and if you've already filled it out, I apologize for that or been thinking about it, but first question, if you look at your sheet, was in what circumstances might people in our society wear covering? The reason that question's on there because tonight we're studying about Moses covering up his face. And of course, there's different reasons why people would cover up certain things. And Moses had a particular reason why he covered up his face. But instead of dwelling on that question, talking about it a lot, what I'd like to kind of think about is the idea of letters of recommendation. Anybody ever had to have a letter of recommendation? Anybody ever write a letter of recommendation for somebody else? Yeah. So would you say that letters of recommendation are important? Okay, and why is that the case? What are some things that they're used for in our society?
Jobs.
Okay, one of the first and foremost things that comes to mind is a job, and generally, people want you to write a little bit about the character of that person. What kind of individual are they? Do they get along with other people or not? Are they responsible individuals? Are they the type of people that if you need something done that you can tell them to do it and, of course, be trusted to do it? So it's certainly important within the area of jobs. Any other areas you can think of?
Higher education.
Higher education? Yeah. Unfortunately, I've had to write several of those. I'm not very good at writing letters of recommendation, so if you need one, probably not ask me, ask somebody who's a little bit better at writing it. But certainly sometimes scholarships, in order to get a scholarship, or even sometimes to, people in different areas of occupations to get into certain areas, they need some kind of a letter of recommendation to go along with it. I've even written some for adoption agencies. Parents who were, couldn't have children, were trying to adopt, and I had to write a letter of recommendation for that. But, the things that they wanted on those letters, not them, but the adoption company itself, they wanted to know things about, are they active within the church? What kind of values do they have? Is their marriage a strong marriage, or is it, one that's going to fall apart for the sake of this child? Could you commend them? Would you recommend them as being parents? So those are all, there's a lot of different areas where letters of recommendation are used within our society. And why do you think that's the case? Just if you had to stop and think, why would you need a letter of recommendation? Why would you generally say it's the case?
To confirm that you can do what you're asking.
Okay, to confirm whatever that person is wanting to get or to accomplish, that would be one good reason. Any other reasons you can think of?
As the alternative.
Okay, and what do you mean by that?
The opposite of that is, you didn't know anything about someone and you hired them. You take the chance, but you didn't want to just tell someone that they were good and they weren't.
Yeah. And, when I think about, we talked about some of those areas, jobs, scholarships, adoption. Generally, the people who are applying for those things, do you really know them? I mean, once in a while you might know somebody, right? You might have been friends in high school or grew up together or something like that. But generally speaking, they're people who are not well known to you. And so you're relying upon other people verifying, what they told you or what they put on their job application or whatever to be true in nature. So letters of recommendation, pretty important within our society. Now, of course, I asked that question because tonight we're going to read about some people who had some letters of recommendation. And the church at Corinth thought that was pretty important when it came to some things that they were teaching and to listening to people and not listening to people. So Paul's going to talk a little bit more about that. So let's go into chapter 3 here, first 6 verses. Paul, of course, talks about this idea. He's pointed out, that he is indeed a minister, a servant of Christ. And basically, Paul took the attitude, whatever I can do to further the cause of Christ, I'm willing to do that and to take that step. But certainly one of the things that he pointed out is God had entrusted him to be a minister of the new covenant. When Jesus appeared to Paul and gave him a job, his job wasn't just to go out here and to talk to people about everyday stuff, right? There was a message that God delivered to him and gave to him. And so it was his responsibility, it was his duty. He had been divinely ordained to carry this message and to preach it to other people. What was he preaching? Was he preaching the law of Moses? What was the message he was supposed to preach? Yeah, the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? And so that's why he did what he did. That's why he preached what he preached. And that's why he took all those missionary journeys. His job was to spread the gospel or the word. But you read about in the first part of this chapter, he asked this question in verse 3, or chapter 3 and verse 1. He said, do we need, as some others, epistles of commendation to you or letters of commendation from you? One of the questions, evidently, that was being kicked around in the church at Corinth is, how do we know Paul is who he says he is? How do we know that what he's telling us is true? And evidently, it seems like as you read through this chapter, some people had shown up with some letters of recommendation. And evidently, they were pretty important recommendations. They'd come from the higher ups. I think just kind of reading between the lines, and I wouldn't be super dogmatic about it, but what kind of people do you think we're reading about here? Can you decipher anything from chapter 3? What they might be or who they might be? Yeah, and specifically, it seems like their emphasis is really going back to the law, doesn't it? From chapter 3, because Paul spends this time saying, the law was glorious, but the ministration of Christ is much more glorious. And so it probably seems like, and you think about it, it just makes sense. When Paul would go to these places, what group of people caused him the most trouble? It was the Jews, wasn't it? And generally they were following Paul around, weren't they? They were kind of trailing him, and, after he would leave somewhere, I think they'd go in there and try to stir things up and, tear everything down that he built up. And so it just kind of makes sense to me, especially, again, from what Paul writes here in chapter 3, that these were probably Judaizing teachers. These were probably men who had letters from maybe the high priest, maybe the Sanhedrin Council or something like that, maybe even government officials of that day and age who were Jewish in nature. And they were going back through here and saying, listen, Paul shouldn't have been taught you what he taught. He was wrong. And what you really need to focus on is the law itself. And so, basically, Paul was asking them, do you need to see my letters? Do I have to have these letters for you to know who I am and that what I've told you is the truth? So, question number 3 here, he kind of talks about there in verse 3 of chapter 3. He says, clearly you are an epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but by the Spirit of living God, not on the tables of stone, but on the tables of flesh, that is, of the heart. And basically what Paul's telling them is, you guys are my letters. Okay, you are the proof that I am who I said I was. And so question number 3 is this. In what sense were the Corinthians kind of a record or a proof of Paul's values and his concerns?
The way they live.
Yeah, if you look at the fact, well, let's just do it this way. What kind of lifestyle did a lot of these people live before Paul came? Very wicked, pagan, very evil, very immoral lifestyles, right? Something happened though, right? Their lives were changed. They were transformed. Paul writes about it in the book of 1 Corinthians. You know, some of the things that they were. Why did they change?
Interesting. Followers of Christ, members of the way. Whatever.
Because they heard and believed and obeyed the truth. Wouldn't you say? How did they know it was the truth? Yeah, let's turn over real quickly. I don't want to get too far ahead here, but by the time we get to chapter 12, we'll have forgotten all about it. So turn over to chapter 12 with me real quickly here. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And somebody read verse 12 for us, if you would, please.
Truly the signs of an apostle were brought among you in all patience, in signs and wonders and mighty deeds.
All right, we've talked about it before, but when people showed up and the apostles showed up in a place where maybe they'd been before, maybe they hadn't, probably the majority of the people had no idea who they were, knew nothing about their background, where they'd come from. How did they know that what they were teaching was true?
You have miracles and signs to prove it.
Yeah, Paul said, you know yourself that an apostle was among you because you guys saw the signs. You saw the miracles. You saw the wonders that I did. That was proof that I am who I claim to be. And that was proof that what I taught you was true. And the fact that it's changed your lives and the fact that you are now followers of Christ is evidence that what I preached was true. The gospel is the power of God to save and to transform and to convert individuals. So basically, Paul says, I don't need a letter. You guys are living proof that I am who I said I was. So he didn't need a letter of recommendation to back that up or to verify it in any way because the signs of an apostle were worked among the church there at Corinth. So Paul talks about this idea. Of course, he didn't want people to think that he was somebody or he thought that he himself was somebody. But he talks about everything that he had and everything that he was able to do. Where did Paul get this ability? It was all from God, wasn't it? Paul's pointing out there, it wasn't because I was such a qualified individual that God chose me. Where to get his message? God gave it to him, didn't he? Where did he get his abilities? God blessed him with it. Where did he get the opportunities? God gave him the opportunities, right? And so Paul's pointing out, it's not because I wanted to do this. It wasn't because of my knowledge or my ability or my opportunity that this course of action was put into place, but it was all because of God. God gave me the message. God gave me the ability. God gave me the opportunities. And so now I'm out here being a servant or a minister of the new covenant. So he wants them to understand that all these things happened because God wanted them to happen, not because he did, not because it was his idea or somebody else's, but all because of what God did for him. So question number 5 here, he talks a little bit throughout chapter 3 here about the idea of the letter and of the Spirit. What's he talking about when he talks about those things? When Paul talks about the letter, what does he mean? Yeah. The difference between the two would be the old law and the new law, and you read through that chapter there, it kind of bears that out. But he talks about the letter being the old law, the Spirit being the new law. And what was the difference between the letter and the Spirit? There were a lot of differences, but what was the main difference between the two?
One was in the stone, the other was in the heart.
Do what?
One was in the stone over to the tablet, and the other was in the heart.
Okay, yeah, that's certainly one of them. I think somebody else said what I was looking for.
Life and death.
Life and death. that was the difference between the old law and the new law, right? And here's what Paul, and I guess what the Jews really had, or what Paul wanted people to understand, and what the Jews really had a hard time understanding. Just because the law of Moses couldn't give a person spiritual life. Do we agree that it couldn't? Does everybody agree with that?
Yes, it could not.
Yeah. because the Hebrew writer said if it could, it wouldn't have been taken away, right? It'd still be in effect today. But it couldn't give a person spiritual life. Now, it could point them to Christ, couldn't it? It could lead them down the road to salvation, but it could not give them salvation. It could not justify them, could not, blood, bulls, and goats couldn't take away sin. And so, was it still useful though? Was it still a glorious thing?
Yes.
Did it bring people to Christ? Yeah, that was the reason that God employed it, wasn't it? You had all these shadows, we talked about it before, all these types, all these shadows pointing to something greater to come. Teaching men the idea of sacrifice and blood and restitution and all those things that would be part of the greater new covenant. It was a glorious thing that God did, bringing the law of Moses. But it wasn't the most glorious. It wasn't the thing that God intended to last forever. And so the bottom line was this: could the letter give life? Could the law of Moses give a person spiritual life? No. Only thing that it can really do is say you're a dead man. You know, you need blood. You need a sacrifice to take care of your sins. You need to be forgiven. You need a right relationship with God. It could point you in the right direction, but it could never really give life. And so the Spirit, the new law, could though, right? Why is that? What makes it a better law?
Perfect sacrifice.
The sacrifices of the law, isn't it? It's not just the law itself, but it's the sacrifices of that law that make it a better law. Well, we've been studying on Sundays how we have some of the same laws they had back then, right? You know why they're better today than they were back then? Because we have a blood sacrifice that can take away our sins. Didn't have that under the law of Moses. But they were both, Paul didn't want the Jews to kind of get this idea that the law of Moses was worthless. You know, it wasn't something that was great. It wasn't something that deserved honor and praise and recognition for what it was able to do. But in the same breath, he didn't want them to think, well, it's better than the law of Christ, or it's just as good as the new covenant. And so he refers to it as a letter that kills, and again, the law of Christ as the Spirit who gives life. So there's an instance that takes place that Paul talks about. And let's just turn over there. I'm going to run out of time anyway. Turn back to Exodus 34 real quickly. This is pretty key to understanding this passage, or I wouldn't even take the time to point it out. There's a few verses over there. Somebody read for us. Let's do Exodus 34, 29 through 35. Fairly lengthy reading, but Exodus 34, 29 through 35. Not everybody at once now.
And it came to pass when Moses came down from the Mount Sinai with the 2 tables of testimony in Moses' hand, and he came down from the mount, but Moses wist not that the skin of his face shone while he talked with him. And when Aaron and all the children of Israel saw Moses, behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come nigh him. Moses called them, and Aaron and all the rulers of the congregation returned them to him, and Moses talked with them. And afterward all the children of Israel came nigh, and he gave them in commandment all the Lord had spoken with him in Mount Sinai. Until Moses had done speaking with him, he put a veil on his face. But when Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he took the veil off until he came out. And he came out and spake unto the children of Israel that which was commanded. And the children of Israel saw the face of Moses, that the skin of Moses' face shone, and Moses put the veil on his face again until he went in to speak with him.
Okay, so it gives you a little bit of background as to what Paul's talking about when he's writing here in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, beginning there in about verse 7. But question 6 on your handout here, and hopefully you'll see how this comes into play. But why could the Israelites not look at Moses' face? Yeah, it was too bright. Some versions say too glorious. And, you know, that's got to be the meaning of it. It was just too bright, too gloriously bright for a person. You could, you've looked at a bright light before, right? And it's too bright. You can't just stand there and stare at it or it'll hurt your eyes. That was Moses' face. And so could you look at it? Well, yeah, you could see it, but you couldn't stare at it, could you? Just hurt your eyes. It was too glorious. But what eventually faded away? Paul writes about it here in this chapter. Did Moses' face keep on shining like that until the day he died? No. The glory eventually faded away. In fact, the Bible lets us know it was slowly fading away. Day by day, it was slowly dissipating. But could the children of Israel see that?
Think of that, I'll take it down.
They couldn't see it. Why not? What was on his face? He had it covered up, right? He had a veil on his face. And so when they looked at Moses, they couldn't say, well, I think it's a little less bright today than it was yesterday. They couldn't see that this glory was slowly fading away. And that's really the point that Paul is making here about the law of Moses. You know, was it a glorious thing? Yeah. I mean, think about when God gave it on Mount Sinai. We've studied about the circumstances surrounding it. Remember, the mountain was shaking, there was thunder, and there was lightning. God is drawing near, and there's just like this trumpet sound that's getting louder and louder and louder. Man, it was a glorious thing, wasn't it? But what the Jews were really never able to see about the law clearly was that law was supposed to fade away, wasn't it? It wasn't something that was supposed to be permanent. Just like the glory of Moses' face slowly faded away. So, this was the glory, the ministration of death. It's kind of interesting here. If I had a little bit more time, I'd point out a couple of things here. Well, I might. Give me just a second here. Well, verse 7 to me is a pretty important point because sometimes people will take the position, you probably heard me talk about this sometime as we've been studying the Ten Commandments. They'll kind of take the position that when we say the law of Moses was done away with, they'll say, well, that's a ceremonial law. In other words, that was what was written in the book. You read about all these laws written in the book. They'll say the ceremonial law was done away, but the Ten Commandments weren't done away with. They're still in effect today. But if you look at Verse 7, this is a good verse. If you highlight things in your Bible, you write a reference to it, kind of mark that one. But it says there, if the ministration of death, written and engraven on stones, what are we talking about there? Ten Commandments. That's what was written and engraven in stone, right? If it was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly look at the face of Moses because of the glory of his countenance, which glory was passing away. And then it says in verse 11, for if what is passing away was glorious, what remains is much more glorious. What was passing away? What was written and engraven on stones, right? It wasn't just a ceremonial law, but it included the Ten Commandments. So there's a couple verses you can kind of put together to prove that idea. But it is the case that, you know, what was written and engraven on stone was a good thing, wasn't it? I mean, it was a reason for Israel to rejoice and be happy and to honor and respect those laws that God gave them. But think about this too. What if on the day that God, well, let's just say the minute after God gave Israel the Ten Commandments, he said, now you know these are going to pass away one day. What do you think they would have thought about them?
They wouldn't have as much respect, as much obedience.
Yeah. That wasn't the time to make their glory fade away, was it? It was something that God was going to do gradually and slowly, just like the face of Moses. But it wasn't something that, you know, immediately God just pounced all over and said, now, these are going to be done away with, and, you know, don't worry about them. One day, they're not even going to be important. So it's kind kind of interesting to me, again, that glory of Moses' face, it didn't just go down one day, 1 second to the next. It faded away very slowly. And that's kind of a picture, I think, you see of the law of Moses itself. So let's go here. Where are we at? I don't know what I'm chasing rabbits here. Got off on something. Question number 7. What's the difference between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant?
New covenant's more glorious.
Yeah. One thing that you didn't have whenever the New Covenant was given was a fading glory, like you had with the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant, the glory of it faded away, but the New Covenant is much more glorious. Still just as glorious today as it was the day that it was given. Question number 8. So why did Moses cover his face with a veil? Notice the wording there of verse 13. Why does it say in that verse that he covered his face with a veil?
He didn't really want them to know the old covenant was passing away.
Yeah. So they couldn't see the glory fading away, right? And so again, it's a picture of the law of Moses. God didn't immediately want them to see the glory of this law fading away. It was going to be in effect. God knew for quite a while. This was something that was going to take time. It was going to take place over, years and years and years, thousands. And then eventually that glory was going to disappear from that law. But what he didn't want them to see right off was the fading glory of it. And so we have this picture, the Bible says in part, that's why we have this reaction of Moses and him doing what he was doing there. So Paul talks about this idea that the reason that they couldn't see the glory fading away because of the veil. Something was keeping them from seeing that. That particular thing was the veil on Moses' face. And then he talks about people today, or even, I guess, people back then, who have a veil on their heart. So question number 9 is this. What must people do to have the veil that covers their heart taken away?
Verse 16, return to the Lord.
Yeah, turn to the Lord. And think about it this way. And, well, let's just do it this way first, because it puts it more in context. Did a Jew and a Christian read the same Bible? Did they read the same scriptures? Yeah. I don't know how familiar you are with Isaiah 53, but it's prophecy about Jesus. Why is it that when Christians read Isaiah 53 in a church setting, they saw it applied to Jesus, and when a Jew read it in a synagogue, they said there's no way that applies to Jesus? How can two people read the same thing and come out with a different idea? It's because there's something keeping them from seeing the truth, isn't it? It's like the veil. It's like the veil on Moses' face. They couldn't see the glory of the law fading away. And so think about it today. Think about it in the terms of let's just label it loosely as Christianity, and I'm using that term loosely tonight. To apply to all religions that profess to be a follower of Christ in the United States of America. Do we all read the same book? Why do we see things differently?
Sometimes we're veiled by what we grew up thinking or whatever we was taught.
Somebody has a veil, don't they? Somebody has something that's standing between them and the truth where they can't see it. The truth is there. People can see it. But if we allow veils between us and the truth, it's going to keep us from seeing what we should see. Just like the veil on Moses' face kept the children of Israel from seeing the fading of the glory of the law. So, pretty important idea and teaching and concept there, isn't it? We're out of time, but chapter 4, you can kind of look into that. Paul talks about the idea of, how we have this treasure in earthly vessels or jars of clay, some versions say. But he also points out, let's finish on this, number 10 here. Why are some people blind? Why are some people, why can they not see the veil that's blocking the truth?
Mostly because they don't want
They don't want to, but who's the,
Are the word.
Satan's the force behind the veil, isn't he? And, you know, I thought about this question. What will Satan do to keep people from seeing and believing and obeying the truth? Anything and everything he can. Right? And so Satan is going to try to put veils in our lives, isn't he? He's going to use anything and everything that he can to keep us from seeing and believing and obeying the truth. And he kept the Jews from seeing the truth about the law of Moses. So we have to be careful as individuals. Go ahead.
Might be a little off, but it could be kind of like the scales that was on Paul's eyes. You know, you ask about, where did Paul get his confidence? I went back to like Acts 9:15, and where Ananias was saying, no, this guy's pretty bad. Should we do something? And God's like, no, we're going to use him for this whole purpose. So that God spoke to him, telling him that's where he got his confidence from, because God gave it to him.
Yeah. And Paul, of course, Paul had some, that's another study in itself, but he had some physical ailments of some kind. There's some things that kept him from being, well, if he didn't, I'd hate to think if he was more effective, wouldn't you? But there were some things that kind of pulled back on the reins a lot of times for it. And, we have those in our lives too, don't we? We have those things that keep us from being what we really ought to be or could be. Paul's, of course, was something he had to live with. God said, nothing you can do about that. I'm not going to take it away. But we'll talk about that more when we get over to chapter 12, I guess. So, all right. Anybody got any thoughts, comments, or questions? Anything you want to cover real quickly there in chapter 4 that we didn't?